Externalities pose a significant problem for the rational approach, in part because externalities may be incalculable. Under our previous example of Cheesecake Factory In and Out, we might be able to say, well, I know I'm going to have upset stomach if I eat this one or eat that one, or if I eat raw onions, I'm not going to be able to kiss my spouse because my breath's going to be bad. Those sorts of things are not part of the decision about how much nutrition I'm going to get out of the dollars I'm putting in, but they're sort of side or tangential. But let's think about maybe a more reasonable thing that we might make a decision on. For example, the level of funding or student support we're going to give to an individual as they progress through college. Well, think about this, like it's not just going to be how much money we're going to give that student so that they can finish, but if that student then leaves, they're going to carry some debt. And that debt may be large or small. If they have a large amount of debt, it's going to impede their ability to buy houses or to buy vehicles. And they may carry that debt for 10 or 20 years, which means they may have a lower level of investment in their children or in their spouse, or they may delay getting married because they don't want to go into a marriage bringing debt in. And then that might have consequences for their children about how their children perceive education and whether or not those parents who were students are now parents, how much they're going to support their children in school. Let's say they leave with a lower amount of debt that'll allow them to engage in long-term stable relationships faster. They'll be able to buy more stuff because they won't be spending money on the banking debt or student debt in banks. Maybe they'll buy a new car, maybe they'll buy a TV that stimulates economic growth. But then they're also probably more likely to have confidence in having the government provide higher levels of student support. Their children may enter college with a different sort of mindset or perspective. There are lots of these spin-on effects or spillover effects that we just simply can't calculate when we're talking about, like, well, how much money are we going to budget to a college system, or how much interest rate are we going to charge on student loans? Those are really impossible to calculate. So the rational approach can be extremely comprehensive, but also require a significant amount of time in calculating consequences, especially as we talk about externalities and spillovers. So at some point we have to just cut those off, and we have to make a choice. So this whole idea about being perfectly rational decision making is just impossible. Decision makers can't consider all the alternatives, including all the silly ones. They can't really make all the decisions about externalities and where to cut off benefits and what criteria to include. So what happens is most likely we get something called satisficing. And satisficing, Marge and Simon talk about this. Individuals screen out silly options. Well, that's not going to work. That one's not going to work. That one's going to work. And then they really just make these calculated decisions on a couple key items or key alternatives. And then among those alternatives, they actually don't find the most maximizing one. What they'll often do is come up with a satisfactory alternative among 3 or 4. They'll say, well, that one's going to work just well, and it's going to be okay. Let's choose that one. And then you stop calculating. So what we think of as like a really rational decision might not actually be all that rational in terms of economist description of what rational means. What we're going to do is we're going to find a couple key alternatives, do some small calculations, find some that are acceptable, and choose among one of those that are acceptable. One thing that's really hard about the rational approach is it doesn't really talk about who gets to set the goals, what criteria are important. It just says, let's start calculating. Well, who gets to set the goals, what the objective of that decision is, what's important in that decision-making process are all really, really crucial determining what kind of outcome we're going to get. So the rational approach, although it appears rational, actually has a lot of potential problems with it. The second approach is called the public choice approach. The public choice approach is something that governments try to use market-like forces to make decisions. And more or less, it's this idea that because competition takes place in the private sector, and we get some pretty efficient outcomes, some good choices, why don't we try and do that inside government? Well, one of the ways that we do that is privatization. That could be selling a government service, or selling the opportunity to provide a government service, for example, like waste management. That's typically a city function, how to deal with trash. So what we'll do is we'll say, well, we need someone to take away our trash. Let's put out a bid. And they ask for a request for proposal. And the RFP says, request for proposal says we need somebody to take out our trash. It's got to meet this criteria. And we get a whole bunch of these trash hauling companies, and they start making decisions about how much it's going to cost. And they submit a bid to do that work for us. And then we choose among those bids which one's going to provide the service. The government really says we want to get this goal done. Let's figure out how to do it. And we let the private sector make those decisions and tell us how much it's going to cost, and we choose one of those. We do this all the time. We sell permits for things. We sell opportunity to use government resources. Sometimes we even sell government land off to the highest bidder. One of the things that I like to talk about with a public choice approach is we'll have grazing permits. So the Bureau of Land Management has a whole bunch of federal land, and they, as part of their mandate, are to use that land for their best purposes. Well, what are those best purposes? Well, cattle ranching is one of those things. So the BLM will go out and measure how much grass and vegetation there is for the number of cows that can go on that certain space, that lot. And then they'll put it up for auction. So they'll go and there'll be this big, huge auction, and a whole bunch of grazers or ranchers will be there. And the BLM will have an auction. It'll say, well, we've got this piece of land over here. It's got 640 acres. It has about, 1,000 AMUs on it, animal usage units. So you can put about that many cows and calves on it. And how much are people willing to pay for it for a 5-year lease? And then all the people go through an auction. They say, I would do this, I do that. And then eventually we figure out how much it's worth by asking the people who want to buy the grazing permits. And then they pay us to do that. So in some ways, what we can do is we can make decisions about how to utilize land by using auctions. Here's another one. Xanterra Management does a lot of hotels on national parks. Well, instead of having the National Park Service try to figure out how much it should cost for a room to rent at a hotel in a park, like say the Grand Canyon, or how to staff that, or how to when to close it, when to make expansion, the National Park Service essentially sells the right to, like Xanterra, they get their private company. That private company gets the right to use government resources and to make choices about how to staff the government hotels, the government-owned hotels. They have to make repairs, they have to run it, but Xanterra wins that bid. Then they get to run it more or less under the rules of the National Park Service, but to get to run it for a profit, and they'll become efficient. Well, every couple of years, that'll come up for a new bid. There'll be a whole bunch of different agencies trying to figure out what the right cost is, how much they're going to pay the government to use that resource, and how they're going to staff it. And that's really out of the control of the National Park Service. As soon as that person wins the bid under the criteria of the National Park Service, they get to run it, however they want. And this is supposed to be a way for them to, the government to make decisions that will better allocate resources. So a couple other ways that we use public choice to make decision making. We talk about cap and trade in the environment all the time. The EPA sets a standard, and then they allocate permits to people who pollute, and then they lower the amount of pollution over successive years. And the people who have these permits can buy and sell them based on how much they're emitting. And as the cap shrinks, in other words, the amount of pollution that's allowed to exist decreases, then the cost of the permit starts to go up. And it becomes this like stock market, or these trading markets, where if you want to pollute more, you have to buy it from somebody, but somebody else is investing money in pollution reduction strategies. So they have a permit to produce like 10, and they're now producing 5. So they have 5 extra, pollution permits, and they can sell them on the market to these more polluting companies. And the more polluting companies have to make a decision if they're going to buy the permit or invest in pollution control technology. So it's a way for us to achieve an outcome. Like we get to lower the level of pollution, but we don't have to choose how we do it. Those companies who need those permits buy and sell the right to pollute, and they make choices about whether or not to buy permits or invest in pollution reduction technologies. There's another one example there too, but on a more practical level, how do we staff a big, huge department like California Highway Patrol? So we have these regional areas and police officers who've been there who have seniority. This happens in other police departments as well. They get a certain number of points, and then they have an auction. Every police officer gets a certain number of points based on years and type of service and overnight shifts and all these other things. And they get to bid, use their points to choose which work schedules they want. So you can bank those credits and save them up, because maybe in 6 months you need to have a no Sunday work schedule and you want to work during the day. Or maybe you take you pay a lot for a certain shift, and then the next 6 months you bank some of those credits and you have kind of a crummy shift. But all the police officers have a certain number of points, and they can essentially pay using their points to choose which kind of shifts they want to staff. And then the more enjoyable work schedules they cost more. And so the least desirable cost less. And so you can use this bank of points to try and figure out how you want to staff the bureaucracy without having to make, like a manager, assign somebody to the crummy shifts or assign their favorite person to the best shifts. So it takes that decision making more or less out of control of the direct manager and puts it into a system where those people who have to work those shifts get to make choices. Well, okay, the idea is that it promotes efficiency by using the market, and that's good, right? It's a way to do something, but it doesn't necessarily produce the kinds of outcomes we always want. And the other thing is that it sort of, using this decision making, it naively assumes that government doesn't want to make the decisions, that they would rather have the market make those decisions. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes bureaucrats and managers want to make decisions that are hard, and sometimes they have to make those decisions that are hard. And this doesn't work under that scenario because it sort of assumes that everyone's going to participate fully. And I think that can be a real problem using the public choice approach. So we have rational and public choice. A third approach is called a bargaining approach. Bargaining approach looks at a couple of different alternatives to solving a problem, figures out which ones of those are going to be most politically positive or issue salient, trying to figure out who's going to understand that particular policy or decision, who's going to be able to support it. And then we go with the one that's going to have the most political support. Now, the idea behind this is that we have a status quo and we can make some small changes in a direction rather than having to make huge directional changes that are going to be very, very difficult to accept. We can use incrementalism, take where we're at, make a small choice towards a direction that people will support, or towards a direction we know is right that people will be able to support, rather than having to jump to maybe the most efficient decision that's going to be harder to implement or adopt. So we do a small analysis trying to figure out which is a valuable one, which one people are going to be okay with, and then we focus on these immediate consequences and essentially make decisions that are going to be okay with people. Now, bargaining is dangerous, but it's what we do a lot of. What can we get away with? What sort of changes can we make? Think about a water district, and a water district has to provide water, clean water, and maybe even sanitation to its citizens in a community where, currently that community is paying $2, and the costs are going to start running up over the course of maybe 5 or 10 years, where we're going to have to spend $3. We could jump immediately to the $3 per unit, but that's going to be politically very difficult to do. So instead of jumping right to where we need to be, we start raising that rate slowly to $2.25 in the first year, in the second year maybe to $2.50, and then $2.65, $2.85, and then $3. So we phase in those changes. People will say, well, it's not going to hurt me as much right now, and I can ramp up my budget so that I can get to that point. Okay, well, that may end up leaving us a budget shortfall early on that we'll be able to recoup later. But people won't just outright, come with pitchforks and torches to try and kill us because we've made a difficult decision. It does not identify the most efficient options to bargain it out. What it does identify is options that people will be willing to accept. Well, I don't know if that's good or not. Sometimes people make decisions that are really bad for them, but they love it. So this approach is really good at describing how decisions are made, and how they should build some political support for their decisions, but it might not give us a good outcome. And ultimately, there are things that we simply can't bargain out. Like, we might have fundamental values that are in conflict with each other, and as long as we try to figure out what's going to be most politically supported, there might not be a clear case where we can find a middle path. And so sometimes these decisions that are bargained out end up not being the outcome that we typically would like to have.